Hello class, so today I am doing a quick screencast because a student asked via email how to better understand Kant's notion of a synthetic a priori judgment, and so here's my reply. This is from an old movie I found on YouTube, this GIF. It's kind of a cool image of the bird going to touch Kant's papers. Anyway, the point here too is that I will have an extra credit question on the exam on this question. Okay, so on a synthetic a priori statement. So let's look at this really quick. So initially we need to roughly define the terms in a diagram. So we have what's known as a priori, and remember that a there is critical. Sometimes students want to write just priori, but understand that the way it's written is a priori. Okay, and so a priori means a judgment or proposition or thought of truth known prior to experience. So you can kind of see how it's how the word prior is in this Latin word a priori, right? So it's prior to experience. So the example of this is 2 + 2 = 4. At least one of any two contradictory propositions must be false. So these are a priori judgments, propositions, thoughts. Okay. Then a posteriori, so this too has the a before posteriori. A posteriori is a judgment, proposition, thought known after experience. So an example of this is the city of Denver is close to the Rocky Mountains. In other words, we don't have to go to experience to know that 2 + 2 = 4, and then likewise that at least any one of any two contradictory propositions must be false. Whereas here we do need to go to experience to know that the city of Denver is close to the Rocky Mountains. Okay, so an a priori truth is one that is known by way of reason strictly, and an a posteriori truth is known by experience. Okay, so then we have an analytic and a synthetic statement. Okay, so we have statements and judgments here. So a statement is an analytic statement is a statement of truth known by definition. Okay, sometimes in philosophy it's known by the fancy word a tautology, and so that is an example of this is a triangle has three sides, and the way to see this is triangle. The word triangle is defined by three sides. So if you just had triangle here, you automatically know that it has three sides. Okay. So in other words, it's known by definition. The statement is known by definition. Okay. Another example of this would be a bachelor is an unmarried man. Okay. So bachelor there automatically is known even without saying unmarried man. Okay. So this too, corollary here is an a priori judgment. So in other words, an analytic statement is one that is reaching to what is known in terms of something that is a priori. Okay. Then a synthetic statement is a statement of truth known by sensory perception. Okay, so sensory perception, in other words, seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, hearing, etc. The example of this is the table is made of wood. So in other words, this is not an analytic statement. It's not, so in other words, all tables are not made of wood, etc. Right? You could have a table made of steel, or etc. Right? And so there we have just a basic diagram of how all these terms are understood, okay? And our primary concern here is with an a priori and a synthetic statement. What does that mean when they're combined, okay? So once we establish the definitions, it becomes clear that this is epistemological. Philosophically, this is a look into the way in which we have and acquire knowledge. Okay, that's what epistemology kind of means. Then epistemology is the philosophical investigation into the sources of knowledge. Sometimes students want to write that epistemology is questioning knowledge. Well, we're not just questioning knowledge, we're getting to answers. And so when we're looking at what these are, this is an example of how we know things. Notice the key word there, known, how things are known. How things are known is an explanation of an investigation into the sources of knowledge. So if we're investigating knowledge, we're explaining it, and this is Kant's way of explaining knowledge. Okay, so that's why it's understood as epistemology. That's the broad philosophical term for what we're doing here. Okay. So then here's a rundown of a diagram of how to put some of these judgments together to get a feel for their application. And I put these together by with the help of Garth Kemmerling in his philosophy pages on the web. So you could click on there to look at his pages as well. And so here is just a breakdown of how this is actually, how these are combining, okay? How these are combining. So an analytic a posteriori judgment really can't be the case. In other words, you can't have an analytic statement that reaches, that requires experience, right? That, in other words, there is never a need to appeal to experience in support of a purely expletive assertion in purely tautological sense. In other words, the a posteriori judgment cannot be analytic by definition. Okay, so then a synthetic a priori judgment is where we're just staying on the experiential side. So these are relatively uncontroversial matters of fact we come to know by means of our sensory experience. This is how students sometimes think of these things as the difference between facts and ideas. So this might be part of that, okay? Then an analytic a priori statement is where it's all strictly about logic and reasoning. Okay, so merely logical truths and straightforward matters of definition that are necessarily true. So there we get that key word necessity or necessarily true. The reason why this is important is because it also helps us understand some of the problems that Hume was having with causation. Because remember, when we were thinking of causation, we considered that causation for Hume was something that he was speculative of the necessary connection. That brings the two together. In other words, he was skeptical of the reasonable / logical connection, okay? And then we have the most important one, which is a synthetic a priori judgment, which are crucial since they only could provide new information that is necessarily true. And here's the citation for Kemmerling's website. But a synthetic a priori statement is this perfect blend here, and that's also necessarily true. Okay, so once we combine Kemmerling's diagram with the diagram above, we see that a synthetic a priori judgment is a judgment that is synthetic, a statement of truth known by sensory perception, plus an a priori judgment, a judgment of proposition thought of truth known prior to experience. It gives us a synthetic a priori judgment, and as Kemmerling indicates, this provides new information that is necessarily true. In other words, the way that we're working with experience and perceptual knowledge, in other words, our empirical knowledge, is understood by way of reason. So that's another way of of thinking about that, okay? That in other words, when we're indicating it's necessarily true, that's a way of almost saying it's logically true, rationally true. In other words, it must be true. Like 2 + 2 = 4 must be true. So a synthetic a priori judgment about the world must be true, okay? So this is important for a couple of reasons. The first point is that this shows how Kant's epistemology is a perfect blend of empiricism and rationalism. And so empiricism is knowledge known by sense experience, by seeing, touching, tasting, hearing, smelling. And also rationalism is knowledge known a prioristically, in other words, by way of pure reason, logic, necessary truths, etc. Analytic statements are rational, etc. So, secondly, a synthetic a priori judgment is also a rough translation of what is meant by Kant's term transcendental idealism. So on a lot of the feedback I left for students, I pointed this out too, okay? So if you're having difficulty understanding what transcendental idealism means, see it as defined by what a synthetic a priori judgment is, okay? So then, what does transcendental mean? So to rationally go beyond, so the word go beyond is what transcendental means. To go beyond experience is to have knowledge of experience as it appears perceptually. In other words, we need to go to rational thought in order to understand something perceptually, okay? Then idealism is having to do with our mind is hardwired to know and have knowledge about the world. All knowledge is mind dependent for Kant. So, and an idealist. So for an idealist, so Kant's not the only idealist. He's just one of many idealists. So for an idealist, we cannot have knowledge of things apart from our own thinking. Cognition is a precondition of knowledge. Knowledge of the world perceptually is strictly a product of how the rational mind operates. So idealism is how it is that Kant is working through his epistemology. So anything that remains outside of this loop is known by Kant as the thing in itself. Okay? Then there's always something that remains unknowable about anything and everything. So recall too that freedom and the sublime are also examples that exceed reason's limits for Kant. So there's always something that remains unknowable about freedom. By definition, freedom is never fully determined. Otherwise, it would not be known as free. This represents the classic metaphysical dichotomy between free will and determinism. Likewise, ethically, for Kant, we are free and autonomous to act out of duty to always practice the categorical imperative. So notice that there are ways of working here that have to do with reason and duty. In other words, we reasonably understand that we need to act out of duty conscientiously in order to express our freedom. But that freedom cannot be fully determined, okay? So then the sublime is a terrifying aesthetic experience that exceeds our rational understanding. Then at the same time, the sublime experience requires rational cognition to be accessed in the first place. So here's another connection to freedom and then likewise to morality. And we covered all that. I'm not going to get into the details there. So for Kant, we must rationally grasp reason's limitations known deterministically. In other words, we are not to be determined by scientific understanding alone. There's always more to life than strict determinism. So I want to thank the student for asking this question because it goes into a wide-ranging aspect of Kant's epistemology and beyond, also to his ethics and to our ethics too. So thank you again for asking the question, and I hope this helps, and we'll have some extra credit question. We'll have an extra credit question on this in the final exam. So thank you. Bye-bye.